Today I'm going to be showing you guys how I create these epic community posts. They get me lots of engagement and my community is just the best. Today I'm going to be doing what they call a speed art, showing you guys from start to finish how I complete these projects. But in the meantime, while this is being demonstrated, I'm also going to be talking to you guys about some tips and tricks that I use to get my compositions right. Now, I just got to say this as a disclaimer, I'm not an expert. I just love these things and I have a little bit of Photoshop skills. So without any further ado, let's get straight into it. So as you can see, I've already started by cutting out that image that was in the center of the background. This is a background I found off of Google and I decided to use it because I love the way that it brought the composition together. Now, after I finished that, as you can see here as well, I'm changing the color balance of the characters. I'm making sure that they all match the image so that compositing these three characters and blending them into this image seems a lot more realistic. So as you can see, I'm using the curves adjustment layer to go in and adjust, and then after that I go in some levels. I use the curves to change the color balance and I use the levels to change the contrast. And this helps again with the shading, the lighting, with the blending of the colors and bringing the cold tones to a warmer tone and then bringing the tones that are a little too warm a little bit back to the colder tone so that again everything matches. Right here, I'm just simply fixing some of the parts of the sword that have been broken or erased. First off, starting off by selecting the image and then making sure my selection is fine-tuned so that when I'm editing this and replacing the parts and adding the glows and the effects and things like that, there are no overlaps or any bleeding on the image. I also brought in a second sword, again, to fill in some of the gaps in the areas where it's missing that and to just tie in that sword image just a little bit better for the overall composition. Now, lighting is really important when it comes to blending your subjects into the overall composition. So what I use for that effect is I use the exposure adjustment layer. I bring up the brightness, then I invert the mask so that it's not showing anymore, and then I use a brush with a white selected color to brush back in the highlights over the character or the subject. Now at this time, I'm applying a little bit of shadows to the feet area of the characters and the subjects just to make it look a little bit more realistic, like they're actually standing on that floor or on that ground. Now later on, you will see in the video that I go ahead and change that. I delete it and do a new version just because I didn't like the way it was making their feet look. So this is what I was referring to when I said that I went ahead and changed the shadows. I'm using a smaller brush now to go over in a little bit more of a subtle way, just so that the shadows look a little bit more realistic and look a part of the subject as opposed to the one that I did before. Now over here, I'm just bringing in more objects and more elements to add to the whole scene of this composition. And as you can see here now, Ghost Rider without fire on his chains is just not Ghost Rider. So I decided to add flames to every single chain. This actually took me a bit of time, but in the end, I feel like it was totally worth it. Now, as you can see, I was manipulating those elements with a tool called the warp tool. The warp tool allows you to bend and to manipulate the curvature and the overall frame of the image so that you can make something look like it's bending, turning, spiraling, all those things. So that's the tool that I used to bend all the flame strips to the curvature of the chains. Now, as you can see, now that I'm done adding some of the flames, I decided to add a bit of a glow effect to them. So I went and double clicked on the layer and went into the options of it, chose the glow option, and I started adding a bit of a glow effect. Later on, you're gonna see that I add a little bit more glow in a different way. But for now, this is what I was doing just to give it that extra oomph that I believe the flames should have on Ghost Rider. One of the challenges with working with flames and things like this is that when you distort it too much, it just doesn't look that realistic. And I didn't want it to look, you know, cheesy. I didn't want the effect to look bad. So again, I went and did these in separate pieces in different segments. There's the first part there. I raised the bottom so it fits better with his outfit and not, you know, it's supposed to look like it's behind him. Then I do the second part here. And then when I'm done, I go ahead and add a third part just at the tip there, after erasing that extra flame layer that's not needed, like right there. So now I'm gonna add the last piece and I'm gonna go ahead and bend it. It's easier to bend that little piece like that without destroying the rest of the image. So that's what I did for that segment there. Now, if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider subscribing, like the video, and even leave a comment if you can. All those things help me with my video's performance, and it really helps me out as a creator. Another trick that I use, or technique I use when I want to apply an effect from one layer to a multitude of different layers, you can right click on the layer and select an option called copy layer style. Once you do that, you can then select as many layers as you like by using either command to click multiple layers or by hitting select to click a whole group of layers from top to bottom. And when you're done, you can right click on that group that you've selected and then select the option that's called paste layer style. This makes it so much easier so that you don't have to go in on each single layer and change the effects the same way. Now, the next technique that I'm going to be showing you guys is called the perspective tool. I use this a lot to make sure that everything that I'm using to bring my composition together looks like it's from the perspective of if the picture was an original picture. So for example, I took some cracks and I changed the perspective so that it looked like it was in symmetry with the floor. That way, when I go ahead to blend it in with the floor, it looks like it's actually in the ground as opposed to just floating above it. Now, I should probably mention that when it comes to creating titles or using text for your compositions, you have to make it stand out without it completely obstructing the view or ruining the picture, basically. And that's a very challenging thing to do. So if you noticed, I created a bit of like a gradient shade just above Doomslayer's head. so that the words or the text would stand out a little bit more. And how I did this is by selecting the rectangle tool and creating a black rectangle, and then selecting Gaussian blur as an effect by going to the filter tab and selecting blur, Gaussian blur, and I use that effect to create a gradient blur over that rectangle. And by doing so, it gives a nice shade effect so that whatever you're putting in front of it stands out a little bit more. So at this point now I'm working on the background. I already blurred the background a bit. I'm adding a bit of haze by using a brush, changing the opacity of the brush, and just clicking in certain areas to give it that hazy effect to bring separation and depth between the characters in the foreground and the background itself. I also added another layer because I felt like something was missing in the background. It didn't seem dramatic enough. So I added a fiery background that I found on Google as well, and I was able to use that to create a little bit of drama in this composition so that it also complements the characters that are featured in this composition as well. So at this point, I'm just creating some final touches. I went ahead and added some particles and dust effect to give the glow on Dante's sword a little bit of a magical fantasy effect, as if the blade was channeling some sort of like magical energy. And then I also brought in this beam. Initially, I wanted to give the text some flair, but it became too obstructive for me. So I ended up actually using it for the bottom of the blade. And for me, that really helped me tie in that blade into the composition. So you're gonna notice here that I bring it down further, and then I go ahead and change the color. I change the blending mode. I change it in such a way where it doesn't overwhelm the blade, but it adds an effect of like Doomslayer stomping his blade into the ground and creating some sort of like an impact from it, just to emphasize on the power of Doomslayer as the main character in the middle. It also, like I said earlier, it helps me blend in the sword because the sword was just sticking out like a sore thumb for me. And what I did to also blend it in just a little bit better is I added some more haze just to tie it in there so that it looks like there's an effect again coming from that beam, and it's not just like a beam in the floor. So I decided to add a little bit more particles as I felt like it wasn't being used as well as I thought it should be. So I went ahead and added just one more particle effect so that I could emphasize the strength of the particles or that magical effect. Now I used a different one here because this one here was more prominent. I added some of it to Dante's sword, a little bit to Ghost Rider, and I actually ended up using some of it for the sword as well. I reversed it, flipped it vertically, and then it really completed that look of the sword just driving into the ground. This is the final look. So let me know your thoughts. Did you guys enjoy this? Would you like me to show more of how I do my community posts? I have a bunch of other videos that I haven't published yet. I can definitely go ahead and do that for you guys. Thank you so much for watching this far. If you did, don't forget to share, like, comment, and subscribe. I'll catch you on the next one.